Welcome back to the Cat's Tail for the conclusion of this series. The topic we're looking at this time, playing around cards, is one of the most skill testing aspects of the game. Predicting what your opponent is likely to do, and figuring out how you should prepare and respond. In Genius Invocation, you will always be aware of some of your opponent's options by seeing their characters on board and knowing their skills. So it's often possible to predict what your opponent will do with their moves just from that, especially on the first few rounds. For example, if you're facing against this Quicken deck turn 1, then you'll notice their only Electro character is Yai, and the main way of applying Electro is through this summon that they'll want to develop as soon as possible before swapping to the Dendro characters. So it's fairly likely that your opponent won't deal direct damage to your character on the first 2 rounds, but might deal damage on their 3rd round and at the end of the turn. And predicting this can then help you plan your own moves to avoid damage on your own important characters. Trying to predict your opponent's moves with what they have on board is the first step, but then you need to think about the hidden options they might have from the cards in their hand, and ask, what cards would they want to play if they had them? Those are the cards you need to think about playing around. Let's look at some examples. Firstly, cards which provide extra damage are some of the most important ones you need to know about to avoid losing characters unexpectedly. This includes cards such as the Elemental Resonance cards for Pyro, Cryo and Dendro, Adeptus Temptation, and Heavy Strike against normal attack focus decks. The best way to play around these is to calculate the maximum damage your opponent can deal if they had all the relevant cards. You won't be able to prevent your opponent ever from getting kills with these cards, but if you can force them to use these resources to kill an unimportant character, or keep an important character out of kill range, you will gain an advantage. In general, you can tell whether your opponent can use a burst by seeing if their character is full on energy or not. However, cards which give extra energy can allow a burst to happen more unexpectedly, which is why Star Signs and Capsule's Arts are powerful, even though the cards might seem inefficient at first. These cards are often paired with characters with 3-cost bursts, which are often very strong, but hard to reach. So keep these cards in mind, especially if your opponent is close to having full energy on their character. Arguably, the most important card to play around in the entire game is I Haven't Lost Yet. The power level of this card is pretty absurd. It gives you the same effect as Star Signs, but instead of costing you 2 dice, it actually gives you a die back. The downside, of course, is the requirement that you can only play it if one of your characters died this turn. You can expect almost every deck to be running 2 of this card, so you need to think hard whenever you defeat an opponent's character whether they could punish you by playing this card. If it's possible, it's good to play in a way that lets you kill an opponent's character after they end turn, or with summons to deny them this powerful option. Something you should always look at when trying to predict your opponent's plays is the number of dice they have. The fewer dice they have, the more limited their options are, as most skills cost 3 dice. However, there are cards that provide extra dice. Decks with Elemental Resonance will have access to Woven dice, and there's also the Arcane Legend card, Covenant of Rock, for 2 dice, which players may have in their deck from their opening hand. Also, if I Haven't Lost Yet is active, that also gives a die. One powerful sequence to be wary of is Covenant of Rock into either Woven dice or I Haven't Lost Yet, which can allow an opponent with no dice to use a 3-cost skill. Finally, quick swap cards like Leave It to Me and Animo Resonance allow your opponent to swap and immediately use the skill of a character other than their on-field character. Keep an eye on the skills of those other characters and try to imagine what your opponent's best move could be if they could use any of their character skills, especially if you're playing against a double Animo deck. There are many other cards I could mention, such as Food and Ramp, but I'll stop short of describing every single card in the game. The real challenge isn't just knowing what cards to play around, but when and how to do this. If you make weak plays, trying to play around tiny probabilities, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, so sometimes you just have to take the risk. Here are some good rules of thumb. Whenever you can play around a card and still be winning, you should play around it. If you cannot win, if your opponent has a card, you should not play around it. And if you have to make a choice of what to play around the more likely play that your opponent could make. Okay, great, but how on earth are you meant to know how likely your opponent is to have something? In general, the longer you go through the game, the more likely your opponent is to have drawn a specific card. If you click on the deck, you can see how many cards are left. If they've drawn most of their deck, you should probably just assume they have the cards they need, unless you literally can't beat those cards. It's useful to know the rough probabilities, but remember it's worth playing around even tiny possibilities if you can afford to do so. You can also remember the cards your opponent has already played, so you know what cards might be left that you need to still play around. A final tip is that at the start of the game, you can see how many cards your opponent chooses to keep in their opening hand, which can also help inform your decisions on the first few turns. Overall, trying to think ahead, predict how your opponent will play, and plan how to respond is one of the most challenging skills in the TCG. In a way, it feels very like chess. You should be able to predict every move your opponent could make next turn, and how you could respond, but seeing 2, 3 or more turns into the future gets harder and harder, and learning to do this makes up a big part of the skill ceiling of the TCG. If you can put yourself into a position where you win no matter what cards your opponent has, that's checkmate. Let's see if we can take these tips and apply them to some games. Okay, let's have a look at how we can play around cards in this match against Tonari Quicken. So the first thing to think about as we're taking our own mulligan, switching our own cards, is what our opponent does. And we can see opponent switches out 2 cards, replaces 2 cards and keeps 3 cards. And I'd expect one of the cards opponent's keeping to be their own Covenant of Rock, since that's usually played in that deck. So the first couple of moves are just going to be just like book moves, what you'd expect from these 2 decks, where they want to develop their Yaya summon, and we want to develop our Raiden summon to get that Electro application. Opponent is also going to play a Treasure Seeking Sealy, and notably has to tune 1 card to get the Electro dice they need to use Yaya's skill. So that tells us something. We're going to use our own elemental skill. The opponent's then going to swap to Tonari. So now we have an interesting choice to make on our turn. Opponent's quite likely to be using maybe this skill on Tonari, and certainly we know that this Sakura summon is going to go off at the end of the turn. So it's likely that whichever character we end the turn on is going to be taking a fair chunk of damage. And we'd rather Raiden take the damage than Zhang Ling, because we really want to make sure Zhang Ling can get the skill and the burst off. Now, if we swap to Zhang Ling here, it's unlikely that they can do enough damage to Zhang Ling quickly enough to stop Zhang Ling from casting both skill and burst before she goes down. But there is a way. I mean, that deck can have a very strong opening with Quick Fit and Dendro Resonance. So if these 3 cards are exactly Covenant of Rock, Quick Fit and Dendro Resonance, they can actually pressure Zhang Ling enough that she might go down before I can use the Elemental Burst. But especially since they had to tune 1 card there just before, they'd need the 3 Dendro dice, and the fact that they only kept 3 cards from the opening hand, one of which might have been this Treasure Seeking Sealy that you'd want to play on turn 1 anyway, it's very unlikely that these cards are exactly Quick Knit, Dendro Resonance, and the Covenant that they probably kept. So I should be safe here just to swap to Zhang Ling, and even if Zhang Ling takes a bit of damage, she should be able to get off her skill and her burst before the end of the game. Opponent's going to swap to Yaya here, probably expecting a skill here and then to be overloaded back to Tonari, but we chose to tune our use our Pyro Die for the swap notably, so we could play the Liben here to avoid having to do that, and go first on our next round. The opponent's going to develop their Sumeru City, and it's going to use the Covenant of Rock to fodder into the Liban, and that's their whole hand. So when they draw for next turn, they'll have 2 cards, which are just 2 random cards out of the 30 cards from their deck. So, you know, we know that they're not cards they kept deliberately, they're just random 1 out of 30 chance of being any of the cards this player chose to put in their deck. Whereas, for example, this toss-up was a card that we kept deliberately from our last turn, and it's going to come in handy here. Rolling some new dice. So on this turn, the first few moves, we really just want to make sure we get Zhanglin's skill and burst out. And the opponent's going to swap to their Tainari to try to start dealing some damage to our Zhangling in this case. Trigger out their quicken reaction, get their own damage going. Now in this situation, we're okay if our Zhangling dies, we don't necessarily want to put our Nahida at risk. So we can use the Liban here, which should be good. And while we don't care about Zhangling dying, we can make their breakpoints a bit harder. They're very likely to want to use this normal attack. And so we can actually soak a bit more damage on Zhangling by using this Sweep Down. Okay, so opponent is going to, as you'd expect, use their normal attack here. And they've got a Sealy just going off here for 3 more cards. And they're going to use one of these cards, actually a Wave and Die, to fuel their Liban for next turn and swap to deny an elemental reaction from us. So with that Sealy, with this Liban drawing, with their 2 natural draws, that's plus 7 cards the opponent's going to have for next turn, and we really will need to start thinking about playing around those cards. They've basically got 7 new random cards on their deck, although we know one of those was the Elemental Wave and Die. But the other thing to notice here is we are in a good position. The first few turns of the game went quite well for us. An opponent stumbled a little bit. We didn't get value out of our Covenant of Rock, which is definitely a downside for us. But we're in a good enough spot that we should be able to play around most of what opponent can do and still secure a win. So we can play safe, in other words, we don't have to take too many risks. Now, we do have to actually start to defeat their characters, so we're not going to be able to play around I haven't lost yet in that sense, although we're not immediately in danger of being ruined by I haven't lost yet here. So it plays the Sumeru City and just a normal tech on Yae, setting up potentially a kill, a reaction with the Jade Plume. Now again, we are obliged to actually take out their characters, and we do get an efficient kill here with the Elemental Burst. But when you think about what could opponent do, what sort of cards could they have? They could have I haven't lost yet in hand. They have 2 copies of that, for example. They could burst on their Jade Plume Terrace Room and take out Nahida if they have just Dendro Resonance, for example. And we don't really want that happening, so we can play around the Dendro Resonance by using this Mondstadt Hash Brown here, which is therefore quite strong. So they do get to go to their Jade Plume here, and remember they've got 2 Sumeru Cities out too, which can give them some discounts. And they're going to use that Dendro Resonance that we were thinking about before, and just use a skill on Nahida. Now, this is an interesting position because there's actually no way from this spot to guarantee 100% that we win the game. If an opponent has Adeptus Temptation and I haven't lost yet in hand, along with another I haven't lost yet, or a Wave and Die, or a Gambler's Earrings, there's actually no way to win from this spot if they have exactly those 3 cards. However, it is very unlikely they have those exact cards in their hand. And we can minimize the chance of us losing actually by how we play. Currently, if we just pass the turn, if we were to say just use a skill on Nahida or a normal attack on Nahida, we would lose the game if opponent just has a Gambler's Earrings, or I haven't lost yet 1 copy, or a Wave and Die, since they could kill Nahida with 1 skill here, which would deal 4, and then they could use their burst on our Raiden, which would deal a total of 8, and then they would win at the end of the turn, potentially with this Seshiro Sakura, especially if they had, even if our summons go first, if they just had like a food to keep their Shade Boom Terrashum alive, that would be quite dangerous for us. So there's a few ways we could lose. We wouldn't want to lose to them just having a gambler's earrings along with like any food. It's much better to think about playing around playing around that, even if we lose by swapping to Raiden Shogun if they have a combination of 3 cards. You know, this is a much more reliable, much more likely way to win based on probabilities. So yes, if opponent had Adeptus Temptation into burst here, then they could deal 10 to our Raiden, and then they would just need 2 more sources of dice. So for example, well, one of them will be the I haven't lost yet to use the burst, and then the other one could be either Gamblers or Woven Die or I haven't lost yet. But they'd need 3 of those cards, and they might only run 1 Adeptus in their deck. It's very unlikely. So we've minimized the probability of us losing here. Now, as it turns out, opponent does have Gambler's Earrings, which would have won, or indeed the Woven Die, which would have won if we just stayed on Nahida. But this play is much more reliable in this case. Here we go. So although they didn't actually have the food, so maybe say on Nahida would have been okay, this is still the more reliable play for winning in this spot. And in the end we can just close this out with a burst from our Raiden. Take down the match. So you're trying to get into a checkmate situation at the end of the game where whatever cards your opponent has, you can win. But failing that, maximizing your probabilities of winning, making sure you only lose to a very specific set of cards, a very specific bit of luck, that's the goal you're going for, maximizing your chance of winning every game. So here's a quick example. Do we need to think about playing around any cards here? Well, I mean, we've got 3 characters left, and so on Nahida, surely we're okay just to use Nahida's burst, and then we can just go to whichever character next turn if they kill our Nahida. That's fine. Well, no, actually, if you just use that burst on Nahida, we are vulnerable to losing if opponent has, in this case specifically, Gambler's Earrings and 2 Mondstadt Resonance cards. Look, they have 2 characters from Mondstadt, they could be playing Mondstadt Resonance. And while it's very unlikely they have that, it's definitely possible, and we can easily make a play here using a defensive food that means we have no chance of losing the game. In this case, for example, if I put the Lotus Flower Crisp on Raiden, there's no combination of effects they can have to win the game here. And they can. So, it's the end. I set out to make this guide series because I decided there needed to be a resource which a new player to the game could be shown to learn how the game works. Something more accessible than sifting through pages and pages on Reddit or Discord. It took me over 100 hours of work to put these guides together, but I hope you found it useful. Special thanks to everyone who left comments on these videos, letting me know how helpful they were, giving me the confidence to keep making them. I'd like to make more guides in the future, so let me ask, what do you want to see? Maybe more gameplay footage, or maybe guides on specific decks? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you again for watching.